Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Speaker, I too also have no further speakers at this time and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2992? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 1555 to award a Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Filipino veterans of World War II in recognition for their dedicated service to the veterans during the veterans during World War II.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1555, an act to award a Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Filipino veterans of World War II in recognition of the dedicated service of the veterans during World War II.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material in this bill.
Without objection.
And Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent that the exchange of letters between the committees of jurisdiction be included in the record. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a special one for me personally. I arise today in support of Senate Bill 1555, the Filipino Veterans of World War II Congressional Gold Medal Act of 2015, introduced by Senator Hirono. This bill, which was passed in the Senate on July 13, has companion legislation here in the House, H.R. 2737, introduced by our colleague Representative Gabbard, which has 312 House co-sponsors. The reason why it's a special one to me is I've spent a significant time in the Philippines and have many close Filipino friends and know the dedication of the Philippines collectively and those families who paid an ultimate sacrifice during World War II. And I've actually visited our World War II cemetery in Manila and have seen the headstones and gravestones of many Filipinos who were there fighting alongside of us as well. And that's why it's a special opportunity for me as chair of the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over this to be involved. So this bill authorizes the striking and awarding of a single Congressional Gold Medal of appropriate design to the Filipino veterans of World War II in recognition of their heroic and dedicated service. Following the award, the medal will be given to the Smithsonian Institute, where it will be available for display as appropriate or available to display elsewhere, particularly at other locations associated with the Filipino veterans of World War II. The Treasury Secretary is authorized to make and offer for sale bronze replicas of the medal at a price that will help defray the design and production costs of the actual medal. Mr. Speaker, Japanese imperial forces attacked the Philippines the day after bombing the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor almost exactly 75 years ago on December 7, 1941. At that point, the Philippines still were a United States colony. Though the process that led to its independence in 1946 actually began in 1934. Fortunately, the Philippines formed its own armed forces. 4 months before the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt brought the 136,000 members of the force into a full state of readiness to defend the U.S. and its territories and colonies. I will leave it to the House sponsor of the companion bill to describe the heroism of those soldiers and the sacrifices that they made in defense of the United States and their homeland, but suffice to say that it was a difficult and costly defense that they waged. And I'll note that our embassy sits right on the bay in Manila today and overlooks Corregidor and so many other places there in the Philippines that witnessed to those battles, including my own uncle, who at the time served in the Navy and helped deliver goods and services throughout the Pacific and into the Philippines as well. So, Mr. Speaker, Congress has authorized Congressional Gold Medals in recognition of the heroic efforts of Japanese Americans, Native Americans, and Puerto Rican soldiers, among others, in defense of this country during World War II and in other conflicts. This recognition of Filipino veterans of World War II is long overdue, and I urge immediate passage of the bill and reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise today in strong support of S 1555, legislation to award a Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Filipino veterans of World War II in recognition of their service and sacrifice and their role in defeating the Imperial Japanese Army. While we are taking up the Senate-passed version of the Filipino Veterans of World War II Congressional Medal Act today, I want to acknowledge the hard work and dedication of the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who has led the effort to move this same legislation across the finish line here in the House. Since introducing the legislation, Representative Gabbard has garnered the support of more than 300 House co-sponsors, and I am proud to be among them. In 1934, the United States began a 10-year period of bringing its colonial rule to an end. During that time, the U.S. retained control over Philippine foreign policy and maintained the right to call Filipinos into the service of the United States Armed Forces. As tensions with Japan began to rise in 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt invoked his authority to call all organized military forces of the government of the Philippines into the service of the United States. Responding to his call for arms, more than 200,000 Filipinos fought on behalf of the U.S. as part of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East. The force included the Philippine Scouts, the Philippine Commonwealth Army, the new Philippine Scouts, Philippine civilians who served on a voluntary basis, and the guerrilla services who fought behind enemy lines throughout the war. Over the course of the war, an estimated 57,000 Filipinos in uniform perished, and many more Filipino civilians' lives were lost. Despite this loyalty and tremendous sacrifice, and the U.S. commitment to provide Filipinos who served as part of the Allied struggle with full veterans benefits, this promise was shamefully withdrawn by the Rescission Acts of 1946 at the close of the war. While a number of benefits have since been made available to the Filipino veterans, we must continue to work to ensure that those who risk their lives to defend the United States and the free world are provided with the full benefits, honor, and respect that they deserve. This legislation has the support of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Disabled American Veterans, the American Legion, the National Federation of Filipino American Associations, and many other distinguished organizations. And I urge members to pass this legislation, which makes a modest but welcome step to recognize the contributions of Filipino veterans of World War II. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize for such time as you may consume the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce of California.
Where's Dad?
For
Time as you may consume.
gentleman's recognized for such time as you may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support here for the Filipino Veterans of World War II Congressional Gold Medal Act, and I'm one of the proud co-sponsors, along with my colleagues here, of this act. You know, I've had an opportunity over the last couple of years to travel twice to the Philippines. One of them was right after the cyclone hit Tacloban, and we took a delegation there. And as you travel across the islands of the Philippines, it is a constant reminder of the enormity of the sacrifice as you see those battle sites. The enormity of the sacrifice made by this unsung group of heroes who fought so courageously for the defense of our country during what is really one of the most perilous moments of American history. And their valor and their patriotism is deserving of this recognition from Congress. I don't think many Americans understand how quickly the reaction across the Philippines in terms of Pearl Harbor, more than 250,000 Filipino soldiers responded to President Roosevelt's call to arms to fight under the American flag. But in addition to that, just in my state of California, we had 16,000 Filipino Americans that went forward and enlisted, where the U.S. Army then formed the 1st and 2nd Filipino American Infantry regiments. That's where those regiments were organized. On December 8th, 1941, and this was not 24 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it was at that moment in time that Japanese imperial forces attacked the U.S. bases in the Philippines. Filipinos and Filipino Americans fought valiantly in the push to regain the Philippines from imperial Japanese forces. And Mr. Speaker, 57,000 Filipinos in uniform died in the war effort. More than that, among the casualties of those who struggled the Japanese against Japan, but 50,000 Filipinos in uniform, and they gave their lives in battles such as Bataan and Corregidor, and their sacrifice was absolutely instrumental in disrupting the enemy's advancement in the Pacific. As President Harry Truman made clear, they fought as American nationals under the American flag and under the direction of our military leaders. They fought with gallantry and courage under the most difficult conditions. So I'm honored to rise today in support of recognizing these great heroes. The contributions of the Filipino World War II veterans are a very important part of American military history, and their accomplishments deserve the recognition of the Congressional Gold Medal, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
I now yield
thank
5
goodness.
minutes to the lead sponsor of the House version of this bill, the gentlelady from Hawaii, Mrs. Gabbard.
Gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized. 5
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the privilege of representing the 2nd Congressional District in Hawaii, a state that has deep cultural roots and ties to the contributions that Filipino Americans have made to our nation throughout history. From driving Hawaii's plantation-based economy in the early 20th century, serving in our armed forces, to becoming leaders in every industry and sector in our state and across the country. It's an honor to stand here today as a voice for the more than 200,000 Filipino and Filipino American soldiers that served our country during World War II. These loyal and courageous soldiers suffered, sacrificed, fought, and gave their lives alongside their American counterparts throughout the war. We've waited far too long to recognize these heroes who deserve this honor.
I'm gonna cry.
And standing
I'm gonna
alongside
cry.
units like the Tuskegee Airmen and Hawaii's own 442nd 100th Infantry Battalion,
Grandpa's gonna cry
with being
too.
awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, our nation's highest civilian honor. With just 18,000 of these Filipino World War II veterans still alive and with us today, we cannot afford to wait any longer. I'd like to thank the 312 House members, Republicans and Democrats, and 71 senators that co-sponsored this bipartisan legislation, representing nearly every state and territory in our country. I also want to say a special mahalo nui loa to my colleague, Congressman Joe Heck, who is a Republican lead on this legislation, Congresswoman Judy Chu, and Congressman Mike Honda for working with me to push this bill through the House, and my colleague, Senator Mazie Hirono, who is here today, as well as Senator Dean Heller for championing this bill in the Senate, all of our staff, and both Democrat and Republican leadership for their efforts, commitment, and support to passing this legislation. I'd also like to recognize Major General Antonio Taguba, who joins us today in the gallery, and the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project for their years of commitment to this historic effort, and for continuing to fight to ensure we remember and recognize the legacy of our Filipino World War II veterans as a critical part of our American history. Major General Taguba's father, Staff Sergeant Tomas Taguba, was a soldier in the 45th Infantry Regiment Philippine Division that served alongside the U.S. Army during the war, where he fought in the Battle of Bataan. He survived the Bataan Death March. This legislation is a testament to Staff Sergeant Tomas Taguba and the hundreds of thousands of Filipino World War II veterans who deserve a place of recognition amongst our greatest generation. To all of them, maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting to pass this long overdue legislation today. Time is of the essence. We must honor these courageous men while they are still among us and recognize their dedicated service to our nation and our history. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of his time. Members are reminded not to reference guests in the gallery. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with that admonishment, I won't say mabuhay and welcome to our Filipino friends in the gallery, but I would like to recognize at this point the lead sponsor on the Republican side, Congressman Joe Heck of Nevada, for as much time as he may
Gentleman from
consume.
Nevada is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During my time here in the House of Representatives, each congressional session I have introduced the World War II Filipino Veteran Recognition Act in an attempt to restore the benefits that were promised to these brave soldiers by Franklin Delano Roosevelt when they were incorporated into the United States Armed Forces Far East during World War II, but then had those benefits denied by the Rescission Act of 1946. These soldiers served side by side with American troops. They served under American officers. They bled, fought, and died to protect their homeland and on behalf of the United States. I've had the honor to get to know 6 of these gentlemen who lived in southern Nevada. Francisco Sedula, Romeo Barreras, Silverio Charisma, Augusta Opus, Bataan Death March survivor Chelsea Balthazar, and Alberto Briones. Unfortunately, over the last 6 years, 5 of them have passed on, never receiving the recognition that they justly deserve. That's why this bill is so important. While it does not justly compensate these brave soldiers for the service that they gave to this country, this bill, Senate 155, and the companion, introduced by my good friend, the gentle lady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, and of which I am the lead co-sponsor, is in some small way a recognition of the service rendered by these brave patriots. It is for that reason that I rise in strong support and urge all of my colleagues to vote in support of Senate Bill 155 so that we can finally pay some level of recognition to those who serve side by side with American soldiers under American command. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, the ranking member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Bobby Scott.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in support of S. 1555, the Filipino Veterans of World War II Congressional Gold Medal Act of 2015. Filipino Americans have contributed to American life and culture in countless ways, one of the most noble of which is through military service. Over 200,000 Filipino soldiers and guerrilla fighters served with the United States Armed Forces with World War II. Their invaluable service helped to provide the necessary support to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. But for over 60 years, Filipino veterans and community advocates have fought to obtain benefits in recognition that they were promised. In 2009, Congress created the Filipino Veterans Equity Compensation Fund, where eligible veterans who are U.S. citizens could receive a one-time payment of $15,000, and eligible veterans who are not U.S. citizens could receive a one-time payment of $9,000. While this fund has allowed many citizens, many of them, to receive some compensation, in Congress we're still working to make sure that these families get all of the benefits they earned, they deserved, and were promised. Another way that we can recognize these heroes is by awarding them the Congressional Gold Medal.
Yes.
The Senate unanimously passed the Filipino World War II Congressional Gold Medal Act in July. Mr. Speaker, as a co-sponsor of the House version of the bill and a co-chair of the U.S.-Philippines Friendship Caucus, I urge my colleagues to support the legislation so that approximately 18,000 surviving Filipino veterans of World War II may be recognized for their service to our nation. We're forever indebted to these brave soldiers, and it is important that we appropriately express our gratitude for that service. Mr. Speaker, I therefore urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield at this time, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I'm sorry, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentle lady from California, a member of the Judiciary Committee and the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific Caucus, Ms. Chu.
Gentle lady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Over 70 years ago, more than 200,000 brave Filipino and Filipino American soldiers answered the call to fight alongside American service members during World War II. These soldiers served on the front lines and played a critical role in ultimately helping the United States to achieve victory in the Pacific. It is because of their courage that we were able to protect Americans at home while defending democracy abroad. Many of these veterans are now in their twilight years, and it is long past time that we honor them for their sacrifice and service to our nation. While we can never fully repay the debt that we owe these veterans, today we have the opportunity to award them with our nation's highest civilian honor by passing the Filipino Veterans of World War II Congressional Gold Medal Act. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting to pass this critical legislation to honor our Filipino World War II veterans with the recognition they have earned.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
I will continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
And now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from California, a member of the Appropriations Committee and the Chair Emeritus of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, Mr. Honda.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank also my colleague, Ms. Foster, and on the other side, Congressman Heisinger, for bringing this up. It's an issue that is it's been a long time in coming forward. And to Mr. Heck, thank you for your comments also regarding the Filipino veterans' history in World War II. And prior to this, we talked about the Merchant Marines, and I think that the Merchant Marines were a long time past in being recognized for their bravery and their willingness to forge through the oceans to bring materials and artillery to fight fascism in Europe. And today we stand here in 2016 to ask for support for the bravery and patriotism and sacrifice of nearly 250,000 Pinoys, Filipinos and Filipino Americans, to whom our nation owns much. And I will ask this chamber to show its commitment to those who have bled for our nation's principles at a time of great adversity by honoring these brave souls with the Congressional Gold Medal. The Congressional Gold Medal is a symbol of our recognition of their service, but it does very little to recognize the sacrifice and the patience that they had to endure since World War II, when it was mentioned earlier that this Congress had passed 2 rescission bills in the appropriations in 1946, removing the Filipino veterans from the veterans' benefits and the kinds of promises that President Roosevelt and MacArthur had given to the Filipino veterans. The story of these proud veterans begins more than 7 years ago when President Roosevelt did ask the Filipino American soldiers to serve under the U.S. authority during World War II. Under our flag, we drafted them and we asked for volunteers, and we got both from them. And the people of the Philippines valiantly stepped up to this challenge and played a vital role in securing a victory for the U.S. and its allies in the Pacific theater. Historians have long since concluded that these valiant efforts by the Filipino and Filipino Americans soldiers in Bataan helped keep Midway and Coral Islands in Americans' hands at a crucial time during World War II. And over 60,000 Filipino soldiers, alongside 15,000 American brothers in arms, were captured and forced to walk over 65 miles to the prison camps, what was called the infamous Bataan March, the infamous Bataan Death March, to the ships that would take them to Japan, where they became POWs. Several thousand Filipino Americans died along the way, making the ultimate sacrifice in our mutual struggle against fascism and a promise of democracy and self-determination. A lot of these Filipinos had interceded during the march to the ships, endangering themselves of being beheaded or losing the arms of their lives because they're going to offer water and sustenance to our POWs who are being marched to the ships. And we have forgotten that, and hopefully today this Congressional Medal of Honor will help us remember the kinds of things that they have sacrificed. Congress shamefully passed the Rescission Act of 1946, which was mentioned earlier, betraying the promise of full eligibility of rights to Filipino soldiers, turning their backs on these valiant souls. We did this consciously, twice. In February 2009, we were here in Congress at long last, passed legislation that, may I ask for 30 more seconds?
The member, additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. In February of 2009, we were here in Congress at long last, passed legislation that included benefits for Filipino World War II veterans. This bittersweet victory comes in the end of a 15-year legislative battle, which has seen thousands of veterans lose their lives to the passage of time. This year, we must send a clear message to the surviving 18,000 Filipino-American World War II veterans that we are honored by their spirit and moved by their heroism and their patience. Their spirit that remained hopeful through many, many years that the American people, through their representatives in this Congress, would do the right thing. This is the right thing to do. Join me in honoring all the Filipino World War II veterans with the Congressional Gold Medal. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan?
I will continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois?
I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Hawaii and member of the Armed Services Committee, Mrs. Hannah Busen.
Gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I've just returned to the Congress, the 114th Congress, and I'd like to have everyone remember that when I first came here in the 112th Congress is when we had the Congressional Gold Medals to the Japanese Americans who fought in World War II. I remember how much pride they all had to receive that gold medal. And that is why I introduced in subsequent Congress the first attempt to get the gold medal for the Filipino war veterans. In 7 days, Mr. Speaker, we will be commemorating in Hawaii the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 75th anniversary. Imagine, 75 years, and we have still not kept our promise to the Filipino war veterans. Many of them are in both Congresswoman Gabbard and my district. And I must tell you, all that they have asked for is a recognition by this country that they will keep the promises to them. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that it is such pride that I stand here to see that across the aisles we have been able to have this piece of legislation hopefully passed, and to also know the hard work of my colleagues, especially Senator Hirono in the Senate, and of course Congresswoman Gabbard. But there are 2 gentlemen that I also want us all to remember, and that is former Senator Daniel K. Inouye and Senator Daniel K. Akaka. The reason why is because they both said that the greatest regret they had was that we could not, and they could not, change that act in 1946 and keep their word to the Filipino veterans that they would have full benefits, that they could not reunite them with their families as they had all promised. But Mr. Speaker, this act, the act of this gold medal, will make things somewhat right. It will at least say that this great country recognizes the promises that we have made, and this great country will not forget the sacrifices that they have made for us. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all my colleagues vote in favor of this matter, this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Michigan.
I will continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
And Mr. Speaker, I too urge passage of this bill by my colleagues and thank the Filipino people for their support and friendship for the many, many years. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1555? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose the gentleman from Michigan seeks recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass Bill Senate Bill 2234 to award a Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the members of the Office of Strategic Services in recognition of their superior service and major contributions during World War II.
This is awesome. I'm gonna cry. No, I'm gonna
2234,
start
an act
crying.
to award the Congressional
I
Gold
knew so
Medal
many of these
collectively
people.
to the members of the Office of Strategic Services (OSS) in recognition of their superior service and major contributions
awesome.
during World War II.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Zinga, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr.
I am
Foster,
speechless.
each
I'm just
vote
happy.
chair
They
recognizes
needed,
the
I mean, it took 75 years to recognize these men, and I knew these men as a little girl, and a lot of them trained my father in Filipino martial arts, but it's just, I knew their sacrifices, and I knew so many of these men. So this is good. Okay, Facebook doesn't need to see me